In today's video, we're going to be finishing all of the backend code for our project by writing in all of the show, edit, update, and delete routes for our books pages. Let's get started now. To get started, we need to go into our routes folder, select our books route, and we need to define the show route for our new books. Now remember, we need to define this after our new route, just like we did for authors. So let's define it at the very bottom here. We'll say router.get. We want to select by ID, so we're going to say /ID, and then we need to pass it a function, which of course we're going to use an asynchronous function for this. We're going to give it a response and a request, just like that. And inside of our function here, we actually want to define how our book is going to be gotten and shown to our page. So what we want to do here is we'll do a try catch, as we always do. There we go. And if it fails for some reason, we're just going to redirect the user back to the home page. So there's our redirect to the home page. And then we want to get our book. So we'll create a variable, we're going to call it book, and we're going to await the call of book.findById. So this will find us our book by the ID that we want. And as you can see over here, we need to get the author information for our book as well. Because right now, if we just find by ID and we pass it that ID, which is just params.id, it's going to get us a book, but it's only going to have an ID for the author. It's not actually going to have the name of the author or any of the other author information. So in order to get that information, we need to use a function which is called populate. So we can say .populate, and inside of here we pass the collection we want to populate, which in our case is this author variable. So what this does is it'll populate the author variable inside of our book object with all of the author information. So in our case, the name. Otherwise, it'll just be an ID, but with this .populate, it'll actually be an object. And then we can of course say .execute at the end here, so that our function will actually execute. I'm going to drop this onto the next line so it looks a little bit easier to read. And there we go. And now once we have the book, we want to render that show page. So we'll just say res.render. And inside of here, we're going to put books/show, which is the page that we're going to create. And we're going to pass the book that we just queried to that page so we can actually display it to the user. Now let's go into our views folder and actually create that view. So instead of our books here, we'll create a new file and we'll just call it show.ejs. Now inside of this show.ejs, the first thing we want to do is put the title of our page. So we'll just wrap that in h2. And inside of here, we want to say book.title, since this is just going to be what's shown as the title. And we can close off that h2. And now that we have that up and running, let's actually start our server by calling npm run dev start. And we can refresh over here, go to our books page, zoom it in so it's easy to see, and you'll notice we don't actually have links to this show page yet. None of these actually work. So let's go to the index page for our books and wrap this image tag in a link. So instead of here, we'll create an anchor tag, which is just going to point to this new page we just created. So we'll say books/ and then we want the book ID. Close off that anchor tag. And in here, we're just going to close that anchor tag off. Now if we refresh, you see that these are actually links we can click on, and we see we get the title of the book. And if we click on this one, we get the title of this book, and so on. So now let's work on actually styling in the rest of the content on our page. Go into the show.ejs, and inside of here, we first want to include the actual image for our book. So we'll put that inside of an image tag. We're going to give it a source here, which is just going to be wrapped inside of these book.coverImagePath, which is the function that we defined earlier when we were defining the book model. And now that'll be our actual book image. If we save that, refresh over here, you see we have the image of our book being shown, which is perfect. Next, we can work on actually adding in all of this different information for the author, publish date, page count, and description. So the first thing we want to do is the author. We're just going to wrap that inside of a div here. We'll say author, and then that is going to be equal to the author's name, which we're just going to say book.author.name, and close off that div. And the reason that we can access the name of the author, as I mentioned earlier, is because we did this populate here, which preloads all of the author information before it actually returns the book. Otherwise, .author would just be an ID, but now it's an object. And if you save that, we go over here and refresh, you see the author is being shown at the bottom. If I zoom in, you can see it's right down there at the bottom. And I'm going to make this image a little bit smaller so it's easier to work with. We're just going to set the width here equal to 100, and we'll set the height equal to 150. Now, if we refresh that, it's much smaller and easier to work with. As we can see, we have our author right there. Now we can work on our next few lines. So we can copy this down, change this to be publish date, And instead of getting the author name, we want to get the publish date of our book. So we'll say publish date. Now we can save that, refresh, and you'll notice that our publish date is an incredibly long and difficult to read string. So we want to actually convert this to an easy to read string that doesn't include any time information and only date information. So we can just call a method called toDateString, which is going to convert this date object into a date only string. Now, if we refresh, you'll see that we get just the date being shown down here as opposed to all the extra information we don't want. Now let's go back and finish this off with the last few rows that we have. We have the page count, which is just going to be book.pageCount. And lastly, we have the description. And this is just going to be book.description. Now that is all of our different data about our book. So now we can put in our links down here, which are going to be edit, delete, and view. Let's first create that edit link. So we're going to have an href here, which is going to point to /books/ and we want the ID of the book. So let's say book.id. And that's going to go to an edit path, which we're going to define later. Also, we can define the rest of our links here. So let's close this off, say edit, put that in an anchor tag. We can copy this down and we can do the view author link next because that one is going to be very similar. So we can say view author here. And instead of going to books, we're going to be going to authors. And instead of going to book.id, we're going to book.author.id. And we no longer need this edit. And the last link that we need to include is the delete link. And if you remember, we already created a delete view inside of here. We have our delete form. So we can just include that delete form inside of here. We can use the %- symbol to include something. We'll call that include function. We're going to pass it the path, which is just going to be up one directory inside of our partials folder. And it's going to be called delete form. And then we just need to pass it the parameters, which is going to be our URL, which in our case, this URL is just going to lead to /books/ and then we want the actual book ID. So we'll use string interpolation to call book ID, close off that string, close off the function, and there we go. We included our delete button in there as well. Now if we refresh here, you see that we have our edit, delete, and view author button. And if we click the view author button, this is going to take us to the author page for that author. As you can see, the same author name here as is on this page here. And these edit and delete links won't work quite yet because we haven't defined routes for them. As you can see, we cannot get that route yet. So let's actually work on defining the edit route for our books now that we have the show route completely done. The first thing we need to do is to go to our books page here and to create a new route for editing. We'll just copy our current new book route, put a comment in here so we know this is the show book route, and we'll paste this down and we'll call this edit book route instead of new book route. And our link here is going to be, first we need an ID, followed by the word edit, so we know this is our edit route. And of course we're going to have an asynchronous function inside of here. And what we want to do is instead of rendering our new page, we're going to call a function called render edit page, which we're going to create in a little bit. Also, we need to first get the book that we want to render. Instead of passing a new book here, we need to get a book. So we're going to wrap this inside of a try catch as we always do. Put the render edit page inside of here. And if we fail, we're just going to redirect the user back to the home page again. There we go. And now we want to get the book, so we'll just say book is going to be equal to await book.findById, and we just need to pass it the ID. And we don't actually have to worry about populating the author or anything inside of here because we only need the author's ID in order to populate the author field inside of our book's edit page. And now we just need to worry about creating this render edit function here. So let's scroll down. We have our render new page, and our render edit is going to look almost exactly the same as render new. So let's copy this, paste it down. I'm going to call this render edit page. And the only thing that is going to change is this single variable here is going to change from new to edit. So instead of having this code duplicated in both of these places, let's create a single function that both of these render new and render edit functions can call. So again, I'm going to copy all the code inside of here. I'm going to paste it down, and we're just going to call this render form page because this is going to be rendering our form, and we're going to pass it another variable which will just be called form, which is going to be the form we want to render. And then down here where we have our edit, we just want to change this to be that form variable. So we're going to use string interpolation. We need to change these to backticks, pass in our form here, and that's all we need to do in order to dynamically render our form. And we can call this function inside of here. So we can say render form page. First we need to pass through the request, the book, we need to pass it the form, which is going to be edit, and then we need to pass if it has an error or not. And we can do the exact same thing for new, paste this down, but we need to change edit to new. Now we took all of the meat of these functions right here and put it down into one shared function so we don't have to duplicate this code all over. Now if we save this, all we need to do is create an actual edit.ejs file, which will be almost the same as our new one. So let's copy the new one, change this file to be called edit.ejs. It's going to say edit book here, and instead of create, we want to say update. And lastly, we want to change our URL to be editing the book, so we're going to change this to be book.id, and since we don't want to post, we want to actually put, we'll use that method override parameter, and we're going to say put so that our server will know to actually put instead of post for our parameter inside of our controller. Now if we save that and refresh, you'll see that our page renders over here, our book information is all pre-populated, and our buttons changed to be update down here. But if we, for example, change something and we click update, you'll notice that we don't have a put action for our book yet. So let's work on creating the update action for our book. Inside of our books controller, we can just take our create book route and copy this. And before we actually do that, we want to make sure we change this to redirect to the new page for the show of the book after we create a book instead of the index. So now that we have that done out of the way, let's go down here, paste down what we just copied, change this to say update book route. We want this to be a put, and it's also going to accept an ID as a parameter. Then, just as we did for our authors route, if we view the put for our authors, we defined our author out here and then got the author, and depending on if the author was null or not, we did different things down in our error. So instead of here, we're going to do the exact same thing. We'll define our book outside of the try catch, and then inside of the try, we're going to get a book. So we're going to say that our book is going to be equal to book.findById, and we want to just pass in the ID that we got from our request. Then once we get that ID and get our book, we can actually take that book and do different things with it. So we can set all the parameters. We want to set the title of our book equal to the request.body.title. And we'll copy that down a few times because we want to do the same thing with the author. And this is going to be the author ID. Then we want to get our publish date, which is just going to be from our body again. It's going to be publish date. But we need to make sure we convert this string to a date. So we'll say new date is equal to this. And then after that, we have our page count, which is just straightforward. And lastly, the description, which again is straightforward. Now the only thing we have left to add to our request here is the actual book cover. And if you remember, we already created a function to save the cover. So all we need to do is check to see if our cover exists. We can do that by saying request.body.cover is not equal to null. And we want to make sure that the request.body.cover is not an empty string either. So we'll check to make sure that it's not equal to an empty string. And if both of these conditions are not met, so the cover exists, then we want to save the cover. And to do that, we're just going to pass in the book that we want to save it to and the actual cover. So we'll say request.body.cover. And the reason we need to make sure to check that the cover is not passed in is because if you remember right, the cover was defaulted to nothing on the page. Like if we go back here, you'll see that this cover does not actually get defaulted to the actual cover of the book. So we don't want to accidentally delete the cover that the user's already saved to the book. We only want to override it if they pass a new one. So now that we have that done, now we can actually redirect the user to the correct page, which is just going to be the show page for the book. So we'll say book.id in here. This will bring us to the show page if everything's successful. And of course, before we do that, we need to save the book. So we'll call book.save here. And if that's successful, we'll render the book. Now inside of our catch statement here, we need to first check to see if the book is not equal to null, because that means that we were able to successfully get the book up here, but we had a problem saving the page right here. So if that's the case, we just want to re-render our edit page. So we'll change this to say edit. We want to pass the response, the book, and of course true because we do have an error. But if for some reason we were not able to get the book, we just want to redirect the user back to the home page. Now we can save that, and we can change our new book here to be called new book 3, for example. Go down, click update. You'll see that we're actually getting an error when we're trying to update the book, and you'll notice our error message is actually displaying incorrectly. So let's go down to our error message, and instead of saying error creating, we want to say error editing if we're editing for our form. So we can say if has error, and then we want to do the code inside of here, and we want to say if form is equal to edit. So if we're on the edit form, then we want to set the params.error message to be set to error updating book. And if that's not the case, we can just put an else in here, and we can set the param to be equal to creating book. Now we can remove that, resave it, and if we refresh over here, you should see that it says error updating book, which is correct, but we still have an error with our code somewhere, and none of our actual parameters are wrong. So let's go take a look and try to debug that error. The easiest way to do that is to actually look at the error message we're getting returned here. So we can put in the error message here, and we can just log out that error message. And now, if we refresh our page over here, resubmit, scroll down to the very bottom here, you'll see that we get this object being submitted, and it says book validation failed, and it tells us that path author is required, which means that our author variable here is not being set. So now we can look at why that author variable is not being set. And that's because our request.body is using author ID instead of author. If you remember, if we go to our form fields for our book, we created this author select, and we gave it the name of author, not author ID. So inside of here, we need to make sure we use request.body.author. Now we can get rid of all this error checking code since we no longer need it. Resave our stuff so you can see everything's green, it's working properly. And now if we refresh over here, you'll see that it actually updated our book to be book 3. We got no error message and everything went through perfectly. Now the last thing we have left to do is to actually make this delete button delete the user. So we can just scroll down and create a new route for that. So we'll say router.delete. And we want to delete based on a specific ID. So we'll say /ID. We'll make this an async function as always, request response. And make sure that this is actually an arrow, and there we go. And we'll just leave a little comment here that says delete book page. And there we go. Inside of here, we want to first do the same thing we did for our update. We'll create a book variable outside of our try catch. That way we can use it inside of our error catching. Put our catch here. And the very first thing that we want to do is try to get our book. So we're going to say book is equal to await book.findById. We'll pass it in the ID, just like that. And then we just want to try to delete that book. So we'll say await book.remove, which will try to delete the book. And if that was successful, we want to redirect to the book's homepage, just like that. And now we can actually handle our errors down here. So we can say if the book is not equal to null, so this means that we do have a book and we were able to access it. We just want to render the show page for that book since we were unable to actually delete it. So let's say render here, render instead of redirect. We want to go to books/show. We already have our book variable, so we can pass that to our show page, just like this. And we also want to pass an error message that just says could not remove book. And there we go, that's all done. Now we can do our else statement. So if we were not able to find a book, we just want to redirect the user back to the home page like we've done on all of our other routes. Now if we save that and refresh over here, you'll see that it actually deletes our user for our book and it's no longer here. We can do the same thing for this book, click delete, and you see that it's completely gone. We can actually just delete all of our books here, and now we have no more books to worry about. So now let's try adding a book. We'll just give it a name here of title, random date, random page count, random title, and of course a random description. And you see that correctly created and correctly brought us to the right page. The last thing we have left to do is actually make it so that our home page here, these images are actually links instead of just being images. Same thing on our authors page. If we view our author, these are not actually links. So let's first do that on our home page. Go down to our index.egs, and we just want to wrap each one of these images in a link. We'll say href is going to be equal to books. It's going to be /books/ and then we want the book ID, which will just be book.id. Make sure that this is an equal sign here. Close out that a tag. Indent all this. And there we go. Now if we go to our home page, we can click on this and it'll bring us to the book. And now we just need to do the same thing for our authors. So inside of our authors show page, we want to wrap each one of these books inside of an a tag again. href here is going to be equal to /books/ and then we want the book ID. Close this off, indent everything, and close the anchor tag. Now we refresh, and that'll bring us to the book again. View author page brings us to the author, and everything's working perfectly. And now that that's all done, let's add this to Git. So we'll say git.add everything in here, we'll commit it, and we'll just say finish book routes. Since we have all our different book routes, and we can push this to Git. And then after we're done pushing to Git, we also want to push this to Heroku. So we'll say git push master, make sure Heroku master, and this will deploy our changes to Heroku. And now that that's just finished, we can open up our application over here. We'll just go to the home page, and we can see we have our books that are actually linking to our books. We can edit them, make this say new to, update that. You see that everything is updating properly. Going to our authors page, all of these links are working properly. We can delete a book and it's completely gone. Again, we can delete this book and everything is gone. So this is working perfectly. And that's all it takes to finish all of the book routes that we need. And this also completes all of the backend code on our Node.js server for our entire application. All that we have left to do is to style our pages so they look exactly the same as the mockup we have created. That's going to be taken care of in the next few videos, with the next one being focused on general styles and header styles that are shared across all of the different pages. You can find that video linked over here as soon as it releases, and make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the future videos in this course. Thank you all very much for watching, and have a good day.